Thank you. Again, we talk about industrial revolution, or whatever the term is. It's difficult to make it in 8 minutes, so I will try to frame that into 3 statements. And again, these statements, I hope, will be picked up by some of the colleagues on the panels, and we can have a discussion around that. The 3 statements I want to make, and I will elaborate on each of them afterwards in my 8 minutes of time. The very first one is that as an industrial revolution, when we compute the figures based on the potential of this suite of technologies, we come to a conclusion that for the first time, this is a revolution to grab, in the sense that the potential of productivity uplift coming from these technologies is quite unique. And it's actually possibly so unique that it will uplift by a factor of 100% the kind of productivity growth trajectory that we have seen, at least in the developed countries. So the pie will grow. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is that there is never free lunch. When there is a growth somewhere in a revolution, there will be losers and winners. The problem is that, and again, possibly it's my personal fear, but having worked with many companies, many countries, many institutions, I think that Europe is possibly at the verge of being one of the biggest losers in this revolution. And obviously, I cannot stop in complaining, so I will possibly give you a third point, which is what can we do about it? And I think that, in fact, losing is not a fate. It's actually a consequence of no action. And I believe that there is a list of fundamental structural actions that can be done at the level of industries, firms, countries, possibly even Europe per se, which will be quite interesting, at least to have a dialogue on, which today it's actually not at all defined, simply because possibly we think too much incremental versus programmatic. So going to each of these 3 points one by one and try to put a bit of facts behind the statement I made. Point number 1 about productivity. I think Jeff alluded to the different revolutions we have had in the past. And again, if you look from a productivity uplift point of view, if you look at the first one, the steam revolution, it took pretty much 30 years before we got the railroads such that we can really benefit from steam. But at that time, it was 20 to 25 basis points of growth a year, give and take, for the next 30 years. By the way, it looks a very small number, but when you compound these numbers across 30 years, that's 10 to 15% higher GDP per capita. That's a nice Christmas gift, and most of the time, it's enough for people to start having more kids. These kids will start to consume, and then we got a growth in the economy. Now we take the second revolution, which was electricity. Again, it took pretty much 30 years to get to a plateau of growth, and the plateau of growth was in the range of 50 basis points, twice as much as what we have seen in the steam industry. If you go to the PC era, microprocessors and the first digitization, depending on the figures after 25 years and 30 years, we come pretty much to 90 basis points to 1 point of growth, which is quite fundamental. But we believe that if we look at the cherry of the cake from artificial intelligence, IoT, and so on, all the figures we have tell us that the potential will possibly give us 1.5 to 2.5 points of growth a year. And again, if you take the perspective of 2030, 2035, in 15 to 20 years, and you compound this effect, that's 25% higher GDP per capita. Again, if we look at Europe in general, that's pretty much between 7,000 to 10,000 euro per year that we will have as a Christmas gift, and that's quite fundamental. And again, today we all complain of not seeing growth in productivity. This is it. This is one that is quite high potential. Now, again, comes the second question, which is losers and winners. To understand the losers and winners, we have to understand where this productivity will come from. And it comes from a few aspects. The very first one is obviously capital itself will be more productive. That's always good news because most of the time it just enhances the pie. The second one that everybody talks about, and I guess, Yanis, you mentioned that on the Google search, it's the fact that it's usually a substitution of labor for smart capital. And obviously that always makes us a bit in a situation of stress simply because smart capital replacing our cognitive skills is something we don't like too much to hear, but obviously it's one source of productivity. Now, obviously, other source of productivity will come because from every smart capital, you will need new skills to work in complementarity with that. And last but not least, the best, obviously, of productivity source is the fact that we will have new products and services. The simple fact that you can use Netflix today is possibly not necessarily used on AI technology at this stage in terms of the algorithms, but it's obviously using big data to make sure that you can consume it. So the point is that there are just many sources of productivity there. Now, if you look at the losers and winners, the point really is that we should be very clear that the average of this productivity is likely to be 3 times higher for the loss of some people and 3 times higher for the winners. So otherwise stated, if there are 2 points of productivity on aggregate in the economy, possibly some people will lose 6 points of productivity, while some other people will gain 6 to 10 points of productivity, and that means some companies will be big losers. Now, we all talk most of the time about losers being obviously low-skilled people with low cognitive skills. Obviously, they will have a problem. But the second problem is that imagine these people are not only at the low skill, but are working in companies that are themselves not necessarily investing in these technologies and in sectors that themselves are not necessarily in demand in the economy. We create obviously a recipe for disaster. And again, we should not be too technocrats. We should be obviously looking at that from a socioeconomic point of view, which is that most of the time this fear of losing is possibly what refrain people and possibly create some of the crises that we have seen in Europe in the last few years. Now, on top of that, here's the problem. We're going to have losers and winners. But most of the time, there is no solution, in the sense that if you want simply to refrain to invest in this technology, the first thing that will happen is that your neighbors will invest in these technologies, and most of the time will have a competitive gain, and that competitive gains will actually create another issue for your competitiveness of your own country. So this winners, losers is a fate, and the fundamental question is that in this explosion of the distribution between winners and losers, what can we do about it? Here's my third point. My third point is that I think Europe today is actually at the weakest, possibly the weakest link. The reason being 3 observations. The very first one is that we have been losing in the digital revolution. And every cycle of new technology suites, what we see is that the share of companies driving this revolution is actually lower than the fair share that we should have based on the GDP of Europe. And it's going down every time. And the reason being that if you're not very good in big data, you are likely not to be that good in AI, and so on and so on. So there is actually no leapfrog in these technologies. It's a stack of different technologies. The second thing is that we have the weakness of our strength. The weakness of our strength is that we are fully a democracy. And in democracy, 50% of the people can decide the fate of a country. And we know that today, if you look at the future of AI, give and take, 20% of the people today are not doing cognitive skill job, and possibly the mid-market, which is obviously where we create the wealth of economies, because that's where the density of the population is likely to be challenged by AI and cognitive skills, which means that possibly fear plus the statement of losing jobs will possibly create people that says, I want to retrench. So, and finally, it's not about US. These days, obviously, about China, and the density is actually moving to the east, and the competition is coming from 2 sides. So what can we do about it? And again, as a spirit of closing, I will simply say 3 things. In the past, we should look at what we have done. What we have done is that when education in the 1920s were an issue, we went for a major investment in education, i.e. people as high school had to go to high school from 12 to 18 years. What is the next education revolution that we need to do at scale in Europe? Second point is that we've got possibly the best engineer schools. How can we make sure that the engineer schools are actually blended with, economic schools, but also with the capital markets that Europe wants to set up, and making sure that obviously the entrepreneurship is scalable. And point number 3 that I want to put on the table is that it's not about job loss, it's about new jobs. And the fundamental question is, what are the new jobs that we will create in Europe to make sure that we are successfully embracing the next revolution? Thank you.